Thanks to you all for coming, and thanks to the two of you for joining me for this conversation about economic nationalism. So obviously, economic nationalism has been on the rise in the US under Trump. I don't have to say it's been on the rise here in the UK with Brexit. When we threw around the ideas for what topic we might discuss today, we thought, oh, well, by the time March comes, Brexit, at least we'll know. We thought there'd be interesting conversation about what might happen given the details of Brexit, but I don't think we anticipated that we would have no idea as we do tonight. But at any rate, you know, when we think about the rhetoric surrounding economic nationalism, we hear both from Brexiters and from Make America Great folks in the U.S. that the trade deficits and immigration are two of the big pressing concerns, that trade deficits are bad for our economy, that the flow of labor, free flow of labor across borders is problematic. They're, you know, immigrants taking our jobs. So I thought maybe we could start, because I am an economics professor at heart, and, you know, so is Felix, that Felix, can you just talk just quickly about, like, what is a trade deficit, and in what ways is it problematic, and in what ways not?
Okay. Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me, Karine. To me, a trade deficit, the whole connotation of what a trade deficit is sort of misplaced. When we hear the word deficit, it has this negative vibe to it, right? Personal deficits, of course. Public deficits, yes, I would agree. But a trade deficit, I sort of feel that word is misplaced. You know, from the basics, what does it mean? We're importing more than we're exporting. For consumers, it implies that we are consuming more than we're domestically producing. And so, how do we finance that consumption? If we're not producing it domestically, you have to turn towards foreign sources, imports, to fill that demand for goods and services. And for most economists, I think that consumption is a good thing. Consuming is making us happy in some ways. And so to say that it's a deficit and that it's bad is sort of misplaced, in my opinion. Now, I think a related question to whether it's good or bad, I think we should talk about, you know, what are the causes of a trade deficit, and how do we address it? If we really believe that a trade deficit is bad, what can we do about it? And so the commonly held causes for a trade deficit from economists' perspective are, for one, a strong currency, a favorable real exchange rate, that is. So for the US's case, you know, and historically anyways, for the British pound, two strong currencies that make foreign purchases cheap, make your export expensive for foreigners to purchase, and so that, of course, leads to an imbalance in trade, to a deficit. The second explanation being a large domestic demand that outpaces domestic production. And so if you want to satisfy that demand, you again turn towards foreign product to meet the demand. And again, that's true for the US particular at the moment in comparison to some of the other countries. And then the third reason for why you may or may not see a trade deficit, contributing factor, are differences in interest rates, actually. And that being, if you have a country with higher interest rates at the moment, like the US, which has been raising the interest rates over the last few years, where the ECB has not, it drives investments towards the US, which again strengthens the dollar relative to other currencies, and that leads back to cause number one, and feeds back into that trade deficit. Is it bad? Right? This is then the question: is the trade deficit favorable or unfavorable? And my opinion is it's not bad. Again, what does it mean? We're importing more than we're exporting. We're relying on foreign investment. And you can make the argument that, you know, if the foreign investment is productive, if we're investing into technological innovation, if we're investing into productivity growth, then a trade deficit is actually good. Many countries rely on a trade deficit to get economic development started, right? If the investment is unproductive, however, there is the argument that can be made that a trade deficit may be of concern. And for the US's case, UK also has the second largest trade deficit among the countries, right? So we're talking about the US and the UK. But in the US case, there's a special scenario that the trade deficit has been prolonged for a long period of time now, since the early 1990s, and it's been growing, with the exception of the Great Recession. And there is a particular dependence on China holding that US debt, which amounts now to over $1 trillion. 28% of all debt that is held by foreigners is held by China, for the US's case. And there is a dependence and interconnection between the US and China in that way that may be of concern. That is, if China decides to stop purchasing treasury bills or decides to sell its treasury bills, the prices of those T-bills will drop, which will, of course, lead to a rise in the interest rate. But since that's a benchmark for all other interest-bearing assets in the US, that may push the US into a recession, or at least put up some pressure. And so that may be one of the concerns that why we hear trade deficits are bad. But in general, I'd argue that that is misplaced.
So, of course, I mean, economists always believe, right, that the free movement of goods and labor are going to be things that fuel the economy. But it's certainly the case that some parties are helped and some parties are hurt. So can you talk a little bit about that, about, you know, what about your sense of how this affects perhaps inequality?
Okay, that truly is a big question. And I hope to speak for many economists, but certainly not for all. Yeah. But in my opinion, I'm a trade economist at heart. That's what I teach. That's what I believe in. It's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And every model about international trade that you will find will tell you that same story, that overall international trade is a good thing. It's beneficial, and not just to a single trade partner, but overall, it's a positive sum game. However, if you ask a trade economist, they will also tell you and make sure to acknowledge the fact that there are winners and losers from trade. What we're saying is that the winners win more than the losers lose, right? And so it's a question. It's less of a question, should we stop trade because it's bad? It's more of a question about inequality distribution, like you mentioned, right? And it's a well-known fact, I would say, at least amongst economists, that manufacturing industries, both in the UK as well as in the US, have suffered from international competition, from import competition. The decline in manufacturing started before China joined the WTO, but the rate of the decline in manufacturing certainly has accelerated since China joined the WTO. But on the flip side, you have winners that tend to be concentrated. So for the US, just to pick out an example, would be the high-tech industry, Silicon Valley, that has seen gains from service exports in particular, right? In the UK, it would be the financial sector that has seen the benefits from trade, as well as business services, right? To me, the question is not, should we stop trade and put up roadblocks? US-China trade war, steel tariffs, lumber tariffs in the US, or Brexit, right, that severs these ties and yields less economic integration. It's about how can we figure out how to redistribute that wealth, that prosperity that trade can bring.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, if you take, so let me start by saying why we shouldn't use tariffs. Okay. If you take the steel tariff as an example in the US, you have a steel industry that's been in decline. You have about 200,000 plus or minus jobs attached to the steel industry directly in the US. But steel is also one of the main inputs going into construction, going into car manufacturing, and a host of other industries. What a tariff does is it raises prices for steel, it protects workers from being unemployed, and it raises the wages in that industry. But in the meantime, it also raises steel prices and input prices for all the downstream industries. And in the construction industry, just as an example, there's about 12 million workers in the US. And so the question becomes, is it really a good idea to protect this one particular industry, make it the target, and not thinking about the follow-through consequences. Now, if you look at the data, you may not see the construction industry actually suffering, but I would argue that that's the tariff effect being pushed aside by the boom in the US economy, by the positive effects of the new tax law. And if you look at steel prices, they've gone down 21% since the inception of the tariff. So tariff happens, prices went up, since then 21% decline. So we're at pre-tariff levels. But that's not due because of the tariff. It's sort of masking the tariff effect. So if we think about alternatives to redistributing income, right, or offsetting the losses from import competition, I would, although unpopular, I would say maybe think about an income tax, more progressive income tax system, which of course is not the popular choice, and it's easier to make trade the scapegoat of the problems that are being faced domestically.
Altay, I thought maybe you could help us understand a little bit more about what you're seeing about the effects of even just the threat of Brexit and these trade limitations on trade and on labor flows through your own work, through your business, or.
Yeah, I have to say that what I see. It's very hard for me to generalize based on what I see, but it may very well be representative. What I've seen in my business with the limited number of clients that I provide advice for does carry some symptoms of Brexit and the consequences of Brexit. Bearing in mind, of course, Brexit hasn't happened yet, so I would imagine if it does happen, some of the things that they're worried about might become more pronounced. But so far, what I have seen for some of my clients traditionally have been businesses who've been abroad, who have set up a headquarters in the United Kingdom for three reasons, really. Access to capital, because it's a good place to get either debt or equity funding. Access to markets, because UK was part of the EU. It's a great place to be able to sell your services or sell your goods into through the single market. And access to people. Through the free movement of labor within the EU, based in the UK, you could hire from any one of 27 countries without having to pay thousands of pounds in visa costs to bring in someone from Turkey or someone from the US or Russia or wherever it may be. Since Brexit was announced, I haven't had one new client come to try to relocate to the UK. So that's one effect. Among the clients that I have had, almost all of them have either relocated back to an EU jurisdiction or set up a parallel structure within an EU jurisdiction to be able to continue to access the European market post-Brexit. And this is without Brexit having happened yet. Yeah. Technically today they still have access to the European market. Now, people will say, well, we don't see jobs relocating. However, people aren't necessarily considering the opportunity cost. If I'm a company, I set up a subsidiary in the Netherlands, maybe I didn't fire anybody from my UK company, but every person I've hired in the Netherlands are people that I didn't hire in the UK. Right. And that's certainly been true of the wider financial industry, where because they don't have passporting rights where any past Brexit, where you can't provide banking services to Germany out of the UK, a lot of companies have set up, a lot of big banks have set up operations in the Netherlands, Frankfurt, Brussels, or Paris. And I know 3 people who have been asked to relocate back. But more often, they just won't be announcing new jobs here, they'll be announcing new jobs there. Right. So it's not on paper people being forced to relocate in mass numbers, it's more people being hired there as opposed to being hired here. Other effects we've seen is among the companies who I advise here and I help arrange financing for, quite a few of them have financing facilities or have been talking to UK banks. A couple of the UK banks over the past year did not renew the facilities, their bank lending facilities to the companies. The companies, nothing wrong with the companies. The UK banks just haven't renewed the facilities.
When you say facilities, what do you mean?
Oh, I'm sorry, debt facilities. So I have a loan, I'm a UK bank, I've lent you money. Usually what happens at the end of that term, I refinance you if you're a growing business. One bank is not doing that.
Okay.
So it was refused to renew.
So in effect, they're calling the loans.
They're not, by not renewing the loan, they're in effect calling the loan,
Yeah.
reducing their exposure. So the companies that's subject to this had to then get financing from somewhere else. Also a UK bank, but one that was less sensitive about Brexit. In another case, we have a company that is taking out loans, actually a few instances where the bank has said, look, if you want this loan, you have to sign the loan agreement by the 29th. Otherwise, the terms are no longer valid. Now is the year-end accounts. So a lot of companies are filing their year-end accounts. They're being asked by their auditors to disclose what the risks are with respect to Brexit. So, I mean, we're seeing it in various places. What we haven't seen yet is companies say, listen, I can't find people in the UK to hire, so I don't know what I'm going to do when I need a new CFO or a new financial controller. I don't know where I'm going to get these people from. I haven't seen that yet in my own business. I hear of it. I suspect I would see more of that after Brexit's actually happened. What's interesting, what I have seen is all the local coffee shops in my area all have for hire signs on, which I haven't seen before.
Recent research results that have come out show that although exports for the UK have been increasing, they're lower than they should be by around 9%. And again, just because of the uncertainty that the Brexit creates, the announcement, not because it has gone through, just like you say, companies deciding maybe parallel structures or relocating not to use the UK as a platform to export anymore. So yeah. I would echo that very much so.
So one of the research is very clear in the United States that immigrants actually add to the economy, that they don't take jobs away from native workers. Although the rhetoric, you would never believe that from listening to the rhetoric. But I don't have a sense of what that is like here in the UK. Do you have a sense of
It's the same rhetoric. It's the same rhetoric. They're taking our jobs, taking our pensions, taking our benefits, both at the same time somehow.
So do you see evidence of that? I mean, do you think, like in the U.S., it seems to be more rhetorical, more out of a place of fear than out of
it's certainly
reality?
out of a place of there is a degree of fear and scapegoating, in the sense that it's very easy to when things are not going well, to believe it when some guy comes and tells you that bankers are to blame, or immigrants are to blame, or the EU is to blame, or whatever it is, someone else is to blame.
Yeah.
It's the easiest way to pick up votes. It has been throughout. And particularly when the scapegoats don't have voting rights, it becomes even easier to pick on those people. There are however, consequences of immigration on a local level that when they are not managed can create, do create consternation and upheaval within certain districts. For example, in rural districts where they need people to pick the strawberries and they bring those people from abroad, but then there isn't enough housing, or there aren't enough public services, schools, or hospitals, then one can understand when the local populaces feel like they're being under siege in a way. And it's not the greatest term, but they can, you can kind of understand if the infrastructure is not put in place to absorb the immigrants coming in for work, why that would cause discomfort among local people. That's a justified discomfort. There's plenty other discomfort that they're being told to feel, which is not justified, which I think we would all imagine.
Felix, when you think about inequality and trade, I mean, we talked briefly about, you know, the winners and the losers, but once you said to me that you thought there was a circular relationship between protectionism and inequality.
Yeah, it's similar to what Altay was saying. That is, with trade and import competition, it's really concentrated in terms of who is losing, right? Whether it's at a local level or a specific manufacturing industry, textiles, to pick on a specific industry. And it's not experienced across the entire nation. And I think that it creates this inequality, right? However, if you then throw tariffs in the mix or a Brexit referendum to isolate, protect against import competition, or isolate from economic integration and globalization, I think that one of the experiences that is felt is a rise in prices. And that then is experienced by the entire nation, but of course a rise in prices. Who loses most are folks with the lowest amount of income, right? Whether in the UK, since the Brexit referendum, inflation has gone up 1.5 to about 2% rise in prices. And that's without it going through. And so I think that these protectionist measures can actually amplify some of the inequality. But again, what's the alternative? All right, so the alternative being a trade adjustment program, which is present in the US but is not working by any means.
I'm sorry,
A trade adjustment
What do you mean
program.
by that?
Finding new jobs for folks that have lost a job due to import competition. That's extremely difficult to do, of course, right? So what's the alternative? Would be a better adjustment program, a better way of redistributing the wealth that comes in through economic integration, through international trade. But unless you have that redistribution mechanism, like Altay said, it's easy to find a scapegoat, blame someone else, blame someone else's products for what you're experiencing.
So I know that your research focuses on transportation and transportation and trade, and he does also really cool stuff on natural disasters and trade, but we
Not the
won't-
topic here.
But that's not the topic for today. But if you're interested, you can ask him about that.
Man-made disasters.
No, natural.
No, natural
Yeah,
disasters.
that's right.
Yeah. But can you talk a little bit about some unintended consequences of tariffs that you've seen in your own research?
Absolutely. So that goes back to the trade deficit or a trade imbalance more broadly. If you throw in transportation in the mix, which we haven't discussed, there is a lot, aside from transportation, a lot of side effects that you may not anticipate. One of them comes in through transportation. And so if we think of a global shipping network, for example, that operates on round trips between the US and China, I think it's easiest to make an example. Okay. If the goal really is to shrink the trade deficit to balance trade between the US and China, currently at the rate that it's at, US exporters pay about $800 for a container being shipped to China, while Chinese exporters pay about $2,000 for a container being shipped to the US. That's due to the trade imbalance, the trade deficit that's currently in place.
So it's cheaper for U.S. exporters.
Right, they're
to transport.
benefiting.
They're benefiting.
Benefiting from that deficit, seeing lower transport costs.
And can you explain why the transport costs are lower?
Right, because if you look at a container vessel coming into the port of Long Beach in LA, for example, right, it's completely stacked to the brim with containers. But once that ship leaves to go back to China, it's half empty. They won't even wait for the container to come to port. If it's not there, it'll just go back to China because it's more profitable at the moment. If protectionist policies change that imbalance, and that's not bringing more exports out of the US, right? That's not it.
Right.
It's shrinking the imports coming out of China. then what will happen is that the same US exporters that barely get to export at $800 or, right, face a transport costs maybe $1,600, double what they're paying right now. And so having protectionist policies in place could backfire against your own exports, is what my research is showing in that sense, yeah.
There are lots of unintended consequences.
Yes. Yes.
So I've gotten a little time signal from Katie, so we need to wrap up. But before we do, I just wanted to throw it out to the both of you. What do you think about a way forward?
I'll let you take it first.
I mean, I don't think these things are happening in a vacuum. They're happening because there's been a tremendous amount of inequality created and wealth concentration since the 2008 financial crisis. And protectionism is just a symptom of that. And I mean, it's no wonder that after the 1929 crash, shortly after that, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and then all global trade basically came to a standstill, and we had this Great Depression. If you look at history, when this level, the level of inequality we're experiencing now has happened, I'm sad to say this, but there isn't an instance I'm aware of in history where the world organically got out of it. You had to have the Bronze Age collapse, or the fall of the Roman Empire, or World War II. The Mongols coming in. If we get out of this without any of these things happening, it will be a first. But I don't see this awareness. If you look at the people where this wealth has been created and who are benefiting from it, I don't see an awareness of this. And I mean, the thing that's mind-boggling about it is I don't think people realize how exposed they are. Their wealth is primarily digital. So the mere existence of their wealth depends on the system remaining intact. You might have $1 billion in various banks and investments, but if the global system crashes and servers are blown up and data is lost, suddenly you don't have $1 billion in cash in a bank somewhere.
So
there's a lack of understanding of how reliant everyone is on each other in order for everyone to continue to maintain and conserve what they have.
So
there's no concept of me giving up a little bit to ensure that the system stays in place and is not uprooted.
So how do we take steps as good Macalester community members?
All right. Return to paper. I think that I think you have make a good point, but I'm going to be a little more optimistic on my projections.
Good.
And first of all, I think that since the announcement of the Brexit, my 2 cents have been placed on another referendum at some point in time, which is still an option as of today. We'll see what comes to turn. But in terms of U.S. policy or more global policy, I think that with the next recession, which is overdue in the U.S. at the moment, folks will really start feeling the pinch from the tariffs that have been put in place. I think that it's sort of masked by the boom that the U.S. economy is experiencing at the moment. Once we feel the pinch, I think we'll take steps back from those policies and perhaps see a political reshuffling. Because you can't, in my opinion, you can't sustain that level of protectionism without feeling the pinch at some point in time. So I'd say I'm looking at it a little more optimistic, not a completely overhaul of the system, but a reorientation politically. I think that's on the horizon.
I'm really interested in hearing, and I realize we have a panel of economists, and you've touched a little bit already on immigration, but I'm really interested in hearing from you about what you think about economic nationalism, and to what extent it's actually fueled by fears about economy, and to what extent it's actually fueled by xenophobia and racism, and how conversations about economic policy can benefit us if those aren't really the root concerns about why people are choosing an economic nationalist route.
I think that with the surge of refugees experienced in the EU, it's a bit different between the UK experience versus the US experience. I think that you make a strong point in the UK's case. For the US, I would argue, certainly there's talk about the border wall, no question about that. And it's a little bit different from the UK experience. But is it really the driving force, or is it the inequality that's being experienced? In the US's case, I would say it's the inequality more so than the immigration issue. But on the UK, perhaps the immigration plays a bigger role.
I think they're both integrated.
Yeah.
I think if you were doing well, you were happy. If you were a plumber in the 70s or 80s and could afford a house with a garden, you're less likely to feel hostility towards somebody else. If you and your wife are working two jobs as teachers, and you still can't pay the rent, then I'd say become much more susceptible when someone says, well, actually that's that person's fault. Mm-hmm. They're the reason you're not doing well. Of course, it's much easier to convince them that that's that person's fault if the person has a disposition already to be hostile towards that. So I don't mean to suggest that if there was no inequality, there'd be no racism. It's not the case.
So I have a question, because here in the UK at least, and especially in Scotland, which tends to have more, I guess, socially progressive policies in terms of their economy, they are floating this idea of a guaranteed national income. So what would happen if you guarantee people their €1,000, their £1,000 a month? What would be the implications of that into the economy, especially about consumption, but also about well-being and happiness and the ability to spend time in something else than anxiety over jobs? And that obviously has implications, and there is data for this in terms of health, public health access, education, and other services that tend to be perhaps the alternative for the distribution of wealth. So what can you tell us about that, if at all? Well, especially in the UK, maybe Altay, you might be better placed for this because you live here, but if Brexit happens, aren't we open for any alternative? Because that was already very out of the game. It wasn't expected at all.
Universal income is meant to capture a whole bunch of different things. Economic theory tells you if you give everyone the same, the same amount of money on top of everything that they have, well, firstly, who's going to pay for that? Secondly, the only thing that's going to do is the prices are going to go up for everything. So, okay, maybe you have $10 more, but so do they, right? We're still trying to buy the same fruit. So the price of fruit's going to go up. And then you have in the United Kingdom a universal credit already. So, and if you look at the people who voted for Brexit, a lot of those, I'd wonder if you look at the areas where the Brexit has happened, those tend to be areas where there's already a lot of universal credit, or in the old system, benefits. So that suggests that there wouldn't be any benefit of that, because the benefit and universal credit system here, at least under the benefit system, you wouldn't have a great life, but you could be able to live depending on what region you are. The universal credit system is less allowing for that. But it does seem to indicate that if you just give money out to everybody, that does not necessarily just by itself make everybody happy. Plus, who's going to pay for it? How? And if I'm getting that, have I paid for that by a school closing, or the school fee going up, or the local hospital closing, etc.? It's a big question about who pays for that. What is the cost of me receiving that extra income in terms of what I lose elsewhere?
Yeah, I'd feed off of that a little bit. I mean, that sounds like a minimum wage policy at the end of the day. What the employment effects are, I will ask the labor economist in a second, but I think my understanding is still on debate what the employment effects are of a minimum wage exactly. But I think you raise a great point. Who's going to pay for that? And the other thing that I would bring up is what does that do to the incentive structure? For economists, we think about incentives and what a policy might do to your incentive. And if the policy is that everyone gets the same wage or is guaranteed a certain minimum wage, right? What is your incentive to work hard or find a job? Now, that may sound evil, or but that is something that we should think about. If the idea is a flat national income for everyone, a flat rate to start off of, and at the end of the day, we're still competing for the same fruit or the same apartments. So what's happening do you have a minimum wage and rent control at the same time, or do you let income go up and rent go up at the same rate or even faster, right? So then it would be a zero-sum game at that.
The jury is out on the minimum wage debate. That it all depends on how you define the market, how you define wages, how you define employment. It's not as easy as when you all learned in principles of economics, where you had this, the supply and the demand, and you put the price control in, and you could see where the surplus went. It's a lot more complicated than that. But it certainly is the case, we see that Minneapolis and St. Paul are thinking about increasing their minimum wages. Macalester is going to have to figure out, we actually don't have minimum wage employees at Macalester except for students. And so we're going to have to figure out, all these students that we pay, how are we going to, as the minimum wage goes to $15 an hour, how are we going to make that work? And what are the trade-offs? What's going to get sacrificed because we'll be paying more in those wages?
10 weeks of research, or is it 8 weeks?
Or do you do 8 weeks of research, right? So these are, they're not. It's not costless. It's not like you can just say, okay, we're going to give everybody this, and then suddenly it's going to be fixed.
I apologize, this isn't a very advanced question, but I barely got a B in principle, so it's just sort of like a silly hypothetical question, I guess, for Felix. But if you had 5 minutes with President Trump and heard that he was open-minded, have his crazy day, he's all over the place, and you could convince him of one, or McConnell, one policy, one shift that he could make and implement, what would you what would be the one thing that you'd like him to?
Oh boy, that's a big one.
All right, and then announce on Twitter afterwards, right?
Yeah.
All right, that's an excellent exam question. I'm going to keep on hang on to this one. As a trade economist, I would urge the president to stop the U.S.-China trade war and not start one with India and Turkey, as has been indicated via Twitter, and instead focus on the inequality aspect through a more progressive income tax. I think that would, maybe not the most popular change in policy, but I think the more effective one. Every tax, every tariff has its welfare implications, right? That's what I would teach you in a 200 level after principles. But tariffs create more deadweight loss than an income tax system would. So if redistribution effects are the goal, then it shouldn't be done through protectionist policies.
So I've been told that I'm allowed to ask a question. I want to come back to this issue of decisions based on economics versus decisions based on other factors like racism and xenophobia, because it's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that, and I know much less about the UK, but in the United States there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that the theory that Trump was elected by those who are disadvantaged by the economic inequalities really is not as compelling as the evidence that he was elected by people who lived in less racially diverse areas, who were more motivated by issues like racism and xenophobia. And we do see a lot of evidence that people, and I'm always interested in how economists understand this, people seem very willing to vote against their own economic interests. And so many of the people who are being most hurt even right now by the policies that Trump is implementing still support him. Farmers, for instance.
Right.
You know, farmers in Iowa will openly admit that they are being hurt by the policies that are being imposed, and yet they will say, I support him. I support the policies anyway. And the same has been true of some of the other industries that have been hurt. And so, I mean, in some ways, this is more of a sociological question than an economic question. But in the face of those kinds of decisions, how, as economists, do you think about that? When people seem to be making consequential decisions in a political sphere that essentially make no economic sense.
I think economists have been sort of pulling their hair out at what's been happening since Trump has been elected, and they'll write letters and they'll sign. You'll get 1,000 or 3,000 economists to sign on to say why this doesn't make sense and this is problematic, and it holds no sway because there's not a rational, I would say a rational, but rather emotional response. And so I don't know. I'll see if Felix wants to jump into the fray. But I think it's not just the people who feel disaffected who elected Trump. I think there's also, in order to make that happen, you had to have well-off people who wanted the tax cuts and who wanted the deregulation. And so I think it's a little bit too simplistic to say that it really is about just this group of disaffected people. I think it's a coalition coming from very different parts of the economy where they're just voting with their pockets. But anyway.
I think it's a good way of putting it. I would add to some extent that perhaps it's a bit of a misunderstanding of what the policies really mean, and now even that they're feeling the pinch from tariffs still being supportive. There's also the promise that it will change in the future, which if it's believed, then it's really just a switch of the perspective. Are we interested in the short run versus the long run benefits, right? So it's possible it's still economic self-interest if you truly believe that in the long run you will benefit, which our economic theory wouldn't support that. So that would be my add-on to your answer, but I think it's a mixed bag of motivations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just add that I would question to what degree they blame Trump and his policies for things not being well, or for things being worse, or if I think it just needs to be questioned. I don't know the answer to that, but I do see a lot of scapegoating still. I don't see a lot of recognition that Trump's policies are causing this, coming from Turkey, where our Trump, who's been in power for the last 16 years and has established his dictatorship, continues to blame other people for the results of his policies, and the voters, either out of fear or out of love for him, continue to vote for him. In the United Kingdom, there's absolutely no recognition that the situation we're in now has anything to do with the people who brought Brexit upon us. I think we've all experienced that, right? Somehow this has happened because of what the Leave campaign said. Yet, despite several Leave campaigners being in the cabinet from the very beginning, running the negotiations for the last 2 years, the last people who are being blamed for Brexit are the Brexiters. Just the mind boggles. The other thing I would query is in the places where there is no economic diversity, no diversity, or areas where there is no diversity, what are the income levels there? Because there are plenty in the Northeast of racially undiverse places that voted and have continued to vote Democrat. So I'm not quite sure that you can completely isolate the two.
Is there any hope for a global Britain? What do you see as the kind of possibilities? And I guess a second question related to the previous discussion, a lot of the Brexit voters thought they were voting for economic nationalism, right? Not global Britain. It was sold as this was going to be more protection. Key proponents of Brexit really have a very different idea that the UK will turn into a kind of Singapore off the shores of Europe. So just if you could both reflect, if this idea of global Britain, what do you see as the future?
I don't think necessarily Brexiters voted for economic nationalism in terms of trade. Free trade that once freed from the EU, that Britain would be able to trade with everyone, has and continues to be part of the rhetoric. The economic nationalism was more on the side of immigration, not so much on the side of trade. In terms of evidence that the country will become, they signed a free trade agreement with Papua New Guinea. There's that. In terms of how the discussions with Trump might go, I would point out that I think, and if I've read the graph correctly, that the UK runs a trade surplus with the US. I think mainly because of heavy machinery and airline parts that get shipped between subsidiaries. But we all know how Trump negotiates with countries he has trade deficits with. So if the UK leaves the EU without any deal, which they're tripping themselves into, and Trump gets to negotiate a new trade deal with a UK that's just fallen out of all of its trade agreements, and it's running a trade deficit with the UK. I can't imagine how that discussion goes well for the UK. I mean, there were talks of the UK having to import chlorine-washed chickens, for example. This made it. I mean, I think when that's all said and done, the UK may end up importing chlorine-washed Boeing 737s. Just, it doesn't give you confidence given how Trump has treated other countries in trade negotiations, that the UK would fare much better. I mean, it's a nice thought, but in reality, we're in a more protectionist world. And in reality, both Japan and China have said the only way you're trading with us is through the EU, so stay in the single market. And Trump, as I said, can't wait to get his hands on the UK after they leave.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I hope you got a little taste of what the Big Questions series has been about. This has been a real pleasure for us to be here and to dig into what we think of as one of our MAC moments.